Many people, including me, have been very concerned with Intel's Advanced Management Technology, AMT. And the main module in it is the Intel Management Engine, IME. This is typically part of a family feature set on Intel chips called vPro. Sometime in 9th generation Intel chips for consumer laptops, Intel removed the vPro feature, which means in theory AMT IME was disabled for many models. I was specifically awaiting this since I was quite worried about the Intel Management Engine. I thought that perhaps with the removal of vPro that the vulnerability of my Intel computer would be eliminated. However, here we are in 2023 and I performed a test on my newer computers, a 10th gen CPU, an 11th gen CPU, and a 12th gen CPU, and a very serious vulnerability was still found using Intel's own testing tool and all connected to IME. Well, zuck! Not only do I have to worry about possibly third parties accessing my computers with a potential backdoor, I now also have the possibility of hackers breaking in and running keyloggers. This is a very serious threat. However, these are also very difficult exploits, so they are not within the realm of kitty crackers. Let's analyze the threats of IME on Intel computers fully updated with information as of 2023. If you have an AMD, you may still have some of these threats, although likely much more mitigated than the one on Intel. Are you interested in learning about this? Stay right there. This discussion is quite complicated, and I will try to manage the explanation of the tech details in as simplified a way as I can. In the big picture, the issue is that Intel, for the last 16 years, provided a way for the computer to be remote controlled. This feature was intended for IT departments to be able to manage computers without having to be physically there. The fear, of course, is that if we do not belong to any organization, and these are personal computers, should we fear the possibility of remote access? What can be done about this remote access? Is there a way to stop it? The jury is still out on whether someone can actually remote control any Intel computer using IME directly, but I'll give you my fears on that later. The worst part is that there's actually an exploit specifically targeting the IME capability, one discovered in 2017, a very scary one, and in 2023 it is not fixed, even on brand new computers. And it is not possible to fix it with firmware, so this threat is a byproduct of IME since the modules being exploited are IME related code. By the way, there is another hardware threat on Intel CPUs, also unresolved still, and that's the Spectre and Meltdown threats. I will not be talking about those in this video, but is something to be aware of. Let's start with explaining the basic capability of AMT IME. IME is pretty scary. This is the kind of stuff that an IT tech can do to a computer. The tech can remotely turn on a computer that is turned off. He can examine the hard drive. He can install a different operating system. He can reinstall an operating system. The tech can modify files on the computer. The only requirement is that the computer be physically wired using Ethernet to the network, and of course that there's power to the computer, meaning it is plugged in. It can be off. It is possible to also connect to a computer using a wireless network, but the computer must already be on. You cannot do remote power on via Wi-Fi since there is no network connection to allow initiation of the startup command. You can see now why security and privacy-oriented companies have been trying to disable IME on Intel chips. Supposedly, companies like Purism wipe portions of the code in firmware that call IME. Another company taking steps to mitigate IME was System 76. As it turns out, these mitigation steps may only partially work and may not even be necessary on certain chip models. And in spite of these mitigation steps by these companies, there is still a serious vulnerability. I'll get into that later. What powers IME? Intel chips have a main processor and a coprocessor that actually runs the IME capability. So the IME coprocessor is a second computer, and it can control the main processor as I described. The coprocessor has its own network connection and is not subject to the operating system of the main processor. This is how it is able to send commands to reboot the main processor or turn it on. You can't actually control the coprocessor from the main processor, and the BIOS is in the main processor. So attempts at mitigating IME only succeed in affecting some limited operation of IME at the main processor while leaving the main functionality of the coprocessor untouched. So starting with some chips since 9th gen, Intel disabled the AMT IME feature from certain consumer laptop chips. They kept AMT on the server chips like the Xeon processors. By the way, we are now in 12th gen with the 13th gen being introduced, so this started around 4 years ago. In theory then, personal computer users at home shouldn't be exposed to the threat of IME if you have a newer consumer machine. Those running server farms and corporate organizations can still buy machines with IME for their desktops or server racks. Thus, it shouldn't be necessary to go to suppliers like System76 and Purism for laptops if the CPU chips no longer support IME. Next thing that happened was that mainstream computer laptop manufacturers, like Dell, for example, started modifying the BIOS as well to remove what they see as IME-related code on particular consumer laptop versions, similar to what System76 and Purism did. Now, the reason for Dell to remove the IME code was that vulnerabilities were found in the IME code, and they were given guidance, I presume by Intel, to remove the IME code in the BIOS. This was an effort to mitigate an exploit in IME. Now here's the bad news. Apparently there is no software mitigation possible with some of these exploits. The specific main exploit, and there are sub-exploits, but the main one is called SA00086. I will explain the details of this exploit in a moment, and this is also referred to as the CSME exploit, or the long name is Convergent Security and Management Engine exploit. I'll just refer to it from here as the CSME exploit. The problem is that this exploit attacks a module that is not in the BIOS. It attacks a piece of code that is one of the first things to load during boot and is initiated by hardware. The CSME exploit was discovered in 2017, and what shocked me was that in 2023 this exploit still exists on new CPU chips. So Intel has not fixed it at all. I guess it must be complicated enough that many years later they are still unable to modify the chip to stop calling this module. The fact is that practically every Intel chip is still vulnerable today, even those with an updated BIOS from System76, Purism, and Dell, and so on. It is important to understand the scope of this threat so we understand its effect in real life. Let me explain the seriousness of the CSME exploit, and later I will tell you how to check if you're vulnerable to it. The main threat of this exploit goes beyond even what IME does. In fact, the exploit uses a flaw in the IME module, but it doesn't really use IME at all. The CSME threat is used to gain elevated privileges on the machine. The exploit can be used to steal passwords, read the contents of the Trusted Platform Module or TPM. Since the security keys, encryption, and even BIOS authentication is controlled by this TPM, then it would be possible in theory for an attacker to modify the BIOS on a computer even if the BIOS is locked down with a password. Another fear with this exploit is that this can also be used to intercept USB traffic. Well, unfortunately, keyboards use USB, so this means it would be possible to do keylogging. This TPM security chip inside Intel is similar to the Secure Enclave chip on an iPhone. And by the way, some Chinese hacking group claims to also have an exploit to the iPhone Secure Enclave, so that is a similar threat. Now, this threat is very difficult to implement. It requires multiple things to happen before something like this could work, and the sophistication of this would likely be state-level technology. I probably wouldn't have the fear that this can be used by normal everyday hackers, but I fear those with a lot of resources like state-level players. You can check if your particular computer is subject to the threat of the CSME exploit using a Converged Security and Management Engine Version Detection Tool, or CSME tool. This tool is provided by Intel. I will add the link in the description. You can run this test and you will see if your CPU is subject to this. Unfortunately, I ran it on all my devices and they all reported as vulnerable. You can download the tool for Linux and Windows. I have tried both versions. So again, to summarize the source of the exploit for CSME, it appears to make use of both the TPM or security module and the management engine modules in the coprocessor. So again, to summarize, there are two separate threats, IME itself and the IME exploit. Let me go back to IME for a moment so we understand the total picture of threats. IME is accessed via certain open ports which are made available by the Intel coprocessor. These are a list of ports used by IME. These are used for remote access. As far as I know, the CSME SA00086 exploit does not use these ports. Instead, the exploit can only be done by physical access, although the attack is on the IME hardware. The purpose of IME, again, is to give remote access by tech support to computers in a corporate setting, but access at the hardware level. The way you use IME, you can access the target device using nothing more than a VNC client, something that's used regularly as a remote desktop in Linux to do remote access. So no special software is required to take control of a computer via IME. However, when you actually call up the IME screens, you will be asked to authenticate yourself, and this authentication is done through Intel. Intel has a special provisioning procedure where you're given credentials for IME. So note that this appears to be a centralized process. Intel then gives you the appropriate credentials, which gives you access to the target computer. This kind of technology is already ripe for abuse in a world empowered by three-letter agencies. Obviously, it should be of no particular difficulty for some no such agency to demand access to IME in the interest of national security. And it should be obvious that because of the Patriot Act, Intel would be forced to comply. So in spite of denials by Intel that this can be used as a backdoor, my view of life is that if the technology exists, it will be used against us. We can just call this the Braxman Law of Privacy. This, of course, assumes that this provisioning of access cannot be hacked. So far, I haven't heard of a hack, but then again, three-letter agencies and foreign adversaries would likely hoard these kind of 0 days. So the fact that this feature even exists is always a concern to me and others. Fortunately, what I said about certain models of Intel CPUs having AMT disabled seems to be true. On Linux, here are the simple instructions to test if AMT is enabled. I'll add this to the description. There's an equivalent instruction for Windows, which I will also add to the description. Now, I did run this to verify, but an easier way to check is this. Go to your computer's About settings and find out the processor on your device. In my case, mine is an i7-1165G7. It is a 1-year-old computer. Then search for this. Intel i7-1165G7 on your browser. This should show the Intel site, and then you can see if yours has vPro. My CPU has no vPro, and I've additionally verified that AMT is disabled using the other tool. The vPro check for the CPU model should suffice for most people. Thus, on my particular computer, the only fear is the CSME exploit SA0086. By the way, if it turns out that your vPro is enabled on your computer, very likely you have a desktop or it is older than a 9th gen, in which case you will have both the IME threat and the SA0086 CSME threat. Fortunately, these risks are not unmanageable. There's no reason to panic, particularly for home users. If it turns out that AMT is enabled on your computer, what you will find is that these ports will be open on your computer. For network experts, using a tool like Nmap can be a way to verify this. I've tested mine and these ports are closed on mine. Now you cannot lock these down with a firewall, so don't waste your time on that. The reason is that these ports are opened by the Intel coprocessor, so that is not under the control of the operating system in the main processor. The next thought is to lock them down at the router end, but that is automatically locked down by any home router with NAT or Network Address Translation. This is built into all home routers. Your IP address on your home network is a non-routable, non-internet addressable IP address on IPv4, so NAT will protect you. However, it is possible to have direct access to your computer using IPv6, so I would disable IPv6 on the home router, or at least force it to use link local only. The only IME threat comes from an attacker that's on the local area network. This is, of course, not an impossibility. Today, most Wi-Fis use WPA2, and given enough time, like a week, all can be hacked. So it is possible for an outsider to get on your home network through your Wi-Fi. A way around this is to put a VPN router like a Braxman router in wired mode only and attach the computer to the wired network and have no Wi-Fi at the VPN router side of the network. This is, of course, an extreme security choice. I presume only state-level actors can attack using IME. In general, most people on a home network did not fear IME, assuming it is enabled. And to repeat, most newer laptops no longer have it enabled. So give yourself peace of mind and determine once and for all if your Intel CPU has vPro. No vPro means no IME. If you're on a public network like an airport or Starbucks, then I suggest not using that public network. I doubt if even a VPN can stop the coprocessor from giving access to IME ports. Remember, the coprocessor is not controlled by the main operating system, which means you have no control of it either, and it would operate outside of a VPN. Now, this exploit is a different matter. As of this moment, there is no solution. This is a very advanced threat though, so I don't expect a normal hacker to attack you. One of the difficulties in hacking using the CSME threat is that it requires physical access. Yes, with this access, some state-level actor could change your BIOS and insert even more dangerous code in there. But they have to gain access to your computer. The fear, of course, is that if they do, you'd never know if it was hacked, since it can be done on BIOS. The only solution I can come up with here is physical security. Make sure no one can enter your residence without a trace, and having the security cameras to record that. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee or true mitigation here, but as long as you know that physical access is required, it will make you alert to that possibility. I have the feeling that every single Intel computer, including new ones, will be subject to the CSME threat. You could reinstall the BIOS by downloading a fresh one from the manufacturer if you want some peace of mind. As far as I'm aware, there is no CSME threat on AMD, so that could be the option. Consider using the AMD Ryzen chips. However, the Meltdown and Spectre exploits exist on AMD and even ARM processors, so even with going to a different manufacturer, it will not be perfect. I'm really disappointed that 7 years later, this is still an issue. Some progress has been made on IME itself, but this exploit remains unsolved. I understand that there is no possible way to correct the CPU after the fact, but producing new chips with this flaw still in it? Crazy. Folks, I have products that protect your privacy. We have a Brax2 privacy phone running on open source Brax OS that makes your phone use invisible to external parties. We also do flashing services to the Google other phone models on our store, as well as stocking pre-flashed pixels. We have a VPN service, Bytes VPN, which has features like Tor routing, DNS obfuscation, and ad blocking using Pi-hole. We have Braxmail, which is a metadata-free way of doing email where no one knows where the message originated from. These products are on my app, BraxMe. Come visit us there. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching once again, and see you next time.